Welcome, colleagues. Welcome to yet another seminar. And it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Stanislava Ovseichyk. Stanislava is currently a lecturer at the Department of Stylistics and Language Communication, Education and Scientific Institute of Philology, Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev. Stanislava defended her thesis dedicated to forming Ukrainian environmental vocabulary. She teaches Ukrainian professional language, business and academic Ukrainian language, and linguistic terminology. The sphere of her scholarly interest covers semantics, communication linguistics, and terminology studies. And you can see the topic of her today's presentation today. And Stanislava today will be talking about bringing back Ukrainian terminology. So, Stanislava, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you so very much for having introduced me. So as you have already seen, I will be talking about bringing back Ukrainian terminology. And I would like to say a few words regarding why this topic. It is here for a reason. Of course, we have to take into account the present-day context when Ukrainian language is, so to say, in my opinion, it has become a symbol of nations' unification, and more Russified Ukrainians want to speak Ukrainian. They read books, listen to podcasts, etc., etc. At the same time, we were interested in terminology because a lot of terminology, so to say, during the Soviet days were also Sovietified, or some of them were eliminated all in all because they didn't comply with the present day requirements to creation of terminology. Another thing that also contributed to working on this topic was that about a month ago, I attended the pre-defense of a thesis. And sadly, oftentimes they were using terminology, which in my opinion has been simply copied from the Russian language, because now there is a ban in Ukraine when it comes to citing Russian scholars and researchers. But still, you see a lot of terminology that comes from the Russian language. And the terminology that astonished me, for example, one of them was, you can see it on the screen, in Ukrainian, phraseologism skripa. And this was a thesis dedicated to media linguistics. I want to mention that from the very beginning, and because it's still in the work in progress, I'm not going to comment on the entire thesis, but I'm just going to mention some examples. And when I try to understand where did this skripa come from, because in my opinion, skripa, in English, it's brace or cement, is not that inherent for the Ukrainian language. And for the first time, this skripa in Russian was used by Nikolai Berdyaev, the Russian philosopher. And he was using this term in the context of describing monarchy and its role in Russia back in the day. And then we probably all heard that this term, skripy, was also used by Vladimir Putin in his speech that he made in 2012 before the Federal Assembly. And I'm not gonna cite it, I'm not gonna quote it, but it was mentioned that this skripy built the foundation of the Russian world. And back then, this cement or the skripy was the Orthodox Christianity and common history. So if we mention this skripa, I think we should actually try and figure out what we mean and go to the original source, especially now using this skripa in my opinion, is not quite ethical. Therefore, we're suggesting to substitute it with phraseologism щеплення, or later on, it also used a different term, which said medійний phraseologism, media phraseologism in English. And the second term, in my opinion, also comes from the Russian linguistics, is echofraza, echo phrase in English. And in the thesis, they use it to describe a term that is used in commercials or advertisement, which is a stylistic allusion to certain nomination in different advertisements, commercials, etc. And again, if you think about it, echofraza means repetition because there is the echo part in it. And we suggested, in our opinion, a better Ukrainian language option, фраза відлуння. And when I looked through the sources now, this phrase becomes more and more popular because, again, echofraza can even be found in the modern Ukrainian dictionaries and used to be a norm. But in my opinion, if you think about echo in English, it is used in Ukrainian language, but it is mostly related to the semantics of some physical attributes of the sound. And it makes sense to use it in such words as echolokatia, echolocator, etc. But here, the meaning is different. And again, this is about the background of the idea to work on this topic. And one more thing that I wanted to share with you is basically the work with the students. As aside from philologists and people majoring in Ukrainian language, also work with future translators. We're also analyzing text with them. We're comparing original text and translated, mostly text in English and their Ukrainian version. And we were interested in a text well known to everyone by Astrid Lindgren. I guess everyone read it, about Carlson, or at least heard about it, if not read about it. And we took a look at the modern translation where for magician, they used the word stukar. And the students told me that it was something new to them. They never heard about this word. And we tried to figure out where does this form come from. You can see on the screen that here, when Carlson was showing magic tricks, he is the world's best magician, stukar in Ukrainian. And then when we went through certain dictionaries and sources, they mentioned that stukar is a joker, a rascal, or the modern explanation, the one who can do something in a very good way, in a very skilled way. And it can mean magician, among other things too. So basically, the translator of the Swedish text used this form in a very good way. But the question was how understandable it is for the readers, especially if we're talking about the children. And then we analyzed it, and the students also found this word in a Ukrainian, originally Ukrainian text. You can see the second example was the same word stukar from a book by Sofia Andruchovich, Felix, Austria. And here it is a norm because we're talking about the context of Austro-Hungary back in the day. And this form stukar is pretty motivated, well motivated. But talking about translation, as the students have mentioned, it might be not easy to understand for the kids because they are used to the word focus, like the one that came from the other language, a borrowed one. But we did check. We looked at the dictionary and circus arts. It only mentioned the form illusionist in Ukrainian. The second one, and you can see the definition of this word. And then the question popped up. Is it worth it to introduce this kind of dialect words, as it was mentioned in a dictionary by Boris Khrinchenko, in the text. And in my opinion, again, if children, because we're talking about children as target audience, if they do not know this form, it might pose a challenge for them. If they do know it, then why not? Because shtukar basically is a person that performs certain thing as shtuka. And illusionist is a person who's also an artist and who shows different magic tricks. And if we're talking about the productivity of the model, we have plenty of words that are helping us to understand person's profession. Here's the example of, for example, bjolar, beekeeper, dівчар, shepherd, and then in our yard. And if we're talking about shtukar, in this context, if we're bringing back this slightly forgotten folk equivalence, why not? If we're talking about translated texts, and namely fiction, they also are aimed at not simply improving the aesthetical taste and conveying certain ideas, but also to improve and enlarge our vocabulary and broaden it. So, in my opinion, if we're talking about illusionist and focusnik, we can also use stokar. And another text, which in my opinion was also pretty interesting when it comes to using Ukrainian forms, this is an autobiography by Amelie Nothomb. This is an author from Belgium, and we were interested in the word zwerchnik that is highlighted on the screen. So this is the first paragraph of this novel, and this word that you can see in this first abstract is used in a very good way, very much to the point. And in my opinion, it is a concept in this novel. I'm not gonna retell you the whole novel, but the thing is that this word zwerchnik reflects the relationship between a girl from the Western world who ends up in a Japanese company, and she had many bosses. But the thing is that they all were pretty condescending to her. And again, this dialect word zwerchnik is it speaks volumes here, because it's not only about relationship between a boss and a subordinate, but rather about certain mental conflict between people in the Western and Oriental world. And in my opinion, this word form, zwerchnik, it is very inherently Ukrainian. And of course, talking about dictionaries on economy and management, we didn't find it there. Unlike shtukar, I think zwerchnik is pretty marked word, pretty charged word. And zwerchnik can be used in the fictional context, in media context, but other than that, a boss should be used, kerівник. So this is the background of why we picked this topic. So we had an interest. We were interested in understanding how much we can rely on those inherently Ukrainian terminology that was eliminated by the Soviet authorities, that were forgotten, and how much do they comply with the requirements that we have in the present-day terminology studies. And the sources that we relied on and that became a certain methodological foundation for us were three works. First, Ukrainian language in the 20th century, history of linguicide. As you can see here, we have a group of authors where there is a special chapter dedicated to an entire dictionary of the repressed Ukrainian words. And it is pretty interesting that the authors, probably for the first time, analyzed the archives and gave examples of what the terminology used to be and how it changed in the 30s. The second source is Lexicon of Totalitarianism by Ina Renchka. She is an adjunct in Kyiv Mohila Academy, and she was the first to look into how the Communist Party interfered with the work of Ukrainian lexicographers. So she compares religious, social, political, and art vocabulary, and she looks at the modern dictionary that has 11 um, um, that has 11 volumes, and it was also pretty interesting because it also allows you to take a look at the society back in the day and also how it impacted lexicography. And the third source is Foundations of Terminology Creation, Semantic and Social Linguistic Aspects, monography. And this one relates to our research because we looked at the semantic and social linguistic dimension in the modern academia discourse and how they correlate with the terminology that we have picked in the sources that we analyzed.
Ті джерела, про які я згадувала.
These are the above-mentioned resources. And now you can see the literature that I used in my research. Here you see the list of the dictionaries that we were able to find and the dictionaries which we used in our research. The first dictionary is the Dictionary of the Ukrainian Language, edited by Boris Grinchenko. The second in the list is the Dictionary of Mathematical Terminology, Part 1, Terminology of Pure Mathematics. It is considered to be one of the first dictionaries of the mathematical terminology. The third dictionary over here is Russian-Ukrainian Dictionary of Technical Terminology. And the two remaining dictionaries are the dictionaries by the same editor. I was very much attracted by these dictionaries since they are mostly focused on the borrowings and authentic Ukrainian terms. And I would like to elaborate more on the terms that are offered by Pavlo Shtepach, edited these two dictionaries. The methods of my research were as follows. The method of analytical and synthetic work with the literary sources, descriptive method, comparative method, which was aimed at a comparison between the terms that could be returned into the Ukrainian language, reintroduced into the Ukrainian language. And I also analyzed the semantics of the terms that are currently present in the Ukrainian language. And before elaborating more on the terms which we have analyzed and which, in our opinion, should be reintroduced into the academic discourse in the Ukrainian language, we should give a definition to the word term itself. A term is a word or a phrase that is correlated to a certain notion, with a certain notion of the certain sphere of science or knowledge, and has systemic relations with other terminological units in the same area. The functions of a term are as follows. It is the definitive function and nomination function. These functions are universal, regardless of the context.
термінологів, які стояли у витоків науки, то вони вважали, що
According to the terminology researchers, in early days, a term should be regardless of the context. It should exist regardless of the context. But still, I think that we should bear in mind the fact that some terms nowadays are interdisciplinary, and we have to decide whether it is a biological term or, for instance, a term from other sphere of science. Of course, it has to be without ambiguity within the same area of use. And of course, it has to be motivated. There has to be the rationale behind the use of a certain term. Not all the researchers insist on this rationale, and yet we believe that it is important.
так, і важливо також окреслити етапи розвитку лексикографії саме
It is also important to mention what were the stages of the development of lexicography under the Soviet times. You see, the first stage, the first period, 1917 to 1932. In that period, lexicography was developing rapidly. Quite a large number of dictionaries were issued. According to Ivan Berhradsky, in that period, it was very important to coin the terms that would be comprehensible for the grassroots. I actually believe that a word in fiction or in science should be close to the people. It should resonate with the grassroots. Therefore, in this period, we see that certain Ukrainian terms have been removed from the dictionaries, and unfortunately, now they are rarely used. The second stage is from 1933 to mid-50s. In this period, the dictionary researchers, the dictionary studies are quite fewer, and Ukrainian lexics is approximated with the Russian equivalents. The third stage is the end of 50s, beginning of 80s. In this period, there was less pressure exerted from the point of view of the ideology. But at the same time, it depended on the leadership of the Communist Party in those days. Nonetheless, in this particular period, area-specific dictionaries were published, and also encyclopedias were published. And the fourth stage, beginning of the 1990s and until today. This is the period that we are living in right now, and we see that the rise in the dictionary researches and publishing, but at the same time, there is a lack of methodological background. It seems like anyone could become an editor of a dictionary. It is just a matter of financial resources. But at the same time, we should question the requirements to the dictionaries compilation, as they should comply with certain norms of academic dictionaries, so that they could be reliable sources for the use of students. In our opinion, there are three approaches to compilation of terminology dictionaries. The first one is a romantic approach. The second approach is European, with the wide use of international words. And the third one is conservative. Proponents of this approach believe that there is no need to revise the dictionaries, and there is no need of a reintroduction of certain popular or grassroots terms. In my opinion, we should change the terminology, and we should revise the dictionaries which we are currently using. And we should actually combine these first two approaches, romantic and European ones. And of course, we cannot limit Ukrainian science to the local scale. Therefore, we should also pay attention to the international terms, and we should try to find the middle ground here between Ukrainian terms and international terms. In our research, we focused on the terms that, in our opinion, should be reintroduced and the terms that should not be reintroduced. Here you see a set of terms which require a certain explanation of the meaning. You see here biologia and природознавство. We cannot substitute borrowing biology with природознавство, since природознавство includes also chemistry, geography. Therefore, when there is the need to be more specific in terms of the meaning of this term, готичний and гостролучний. We were very much interested in these two, since we studied a lot about architecture. And I also study at the history department. Therefore, готичний and гостролучний, Gothic is a term that pertains specifically to architecture. But if we replace it with гостролучний, then we need to use the term гостролуччя instead of Gothics. And we actually were doubting whether it is sensible to replace the term that is well established in art and respective studies. Bouquinist and knigar. Bouquinist is a person who is selling rare or old books or used books or antique books. We also found a definition of it as a librarian. Therefore, it does not cover fully the connotation of knigar, as knigar is much wider in the meaning. Therefore, these two are not interchangeable. The next pair of terms is valuta and чужі гроші, currency. Well, we cannot replace valuta, a term that is well accepted by чужі гроші. It doesn't seem feasible, and чужі гроші is coined in such a mode that is not inherent for the Ukrainian language. Ventilator and вітрячок, вітрогінка. In our opinion, вітрячок and вітрогінка may be associated with some other terms. Therefore, this substitution is not substantiated. Бінокль and далекоглядачка. Even though we understand the rationale behind it, but this part глядачка does not comply with the productive models of coining words in the Ukrainian language. Apart from that, далекоглядачка might be associated with something else rather than binocle. Гейзер and горячий водограй. In case of geyser, we understand that this is the term to designate hot springs of volcanic origin. But when we are talking about горячий водограй, it reminds me of fondue, and it could be chocolate fondue. Well, I believe that these terms are confusing, and only partially they coincide in their connotations. Geriatria and stareczoznawstwo. The match between these two terms is only respective. It is not complete, since once again, this is just the whole and its part. Галактика and мряковина. Mryakovina is something that reminds us of a constellation, but just the path of stars, for instance. It looks like it fits within the model of Ukrainian language and the rules of coining words, but at the same time, I believe that the rationale in such replacement is missing. Juvelir and Zolotar. The above-mentioned dictionary, edited by Pavlo Stepa, uses the word zolotar, but in the dictionary by Hrychenko, we see two explanations. Juvelir, jeweler, is the craftsman of gold, but at the same time, there is a different connotation that reminds us of janitor. Therefore, another dictionary also mentions it in such a way. Therefore, juvelir, well, it is not related to cleaning. And I believe that there should be no ambiguity if we are talking about specific terms. On this slide, you see more terms that require comments and deliberation. For instance, штатив and стоячок. I asked a photographer who's an acquaintance of mine what his attitude was with regard to this new term стоячок, and he was laughing at me. We do understand that stativ is basically a tripod that is used to hold camera. But stativ is a term that has been in use for quite a while. Meanwhile, stoячок does not ring any bell to those who work in this area. Manicure and рукодогляд. It looks sensible. It looks justified, but at the same time, there is an issue with semantics, since manicure is about hands, and рукодогляд has slightly different meaning. Matador and быкозмагун. It seems to me that bыкозмагун could be used in fiction, but it might have a certain connotation of irony, or it could be used as a joke. The same pertains to the pair gramophone and samohraika, and then agonia and skinmuki. Skinmuki is completely incomprehensible from the point of view of understanding and guessing its meaning. It doesn't ring any bell, and it does not remind anything that pertains to agonia, agony. Battalion and kurin. Well, they do not completely coincide. Midriyaza and zinkoroshir. Midriyaza is a term of Latin origin, therefore it has prevalent use. Well, we still have some time. Therefore, I would like to continue with the list of terms. These are terms from chemistry, some of them. And they are motivated from the point of view of coining these words. For instance, halogen and chloropet. Chloropet is an authentic Ukrainian word, but at the same time, halogen does not include only chloris, chloride. It is more of general nature. Therefore, and there is some mistake in meaning. Probably chemists that could help us with these terms. They should be engaged in the selection of terms for chemistry. And being a linguist, these chemical terms are not that clear. Another interesting pair here is marzipan and tistечко. Tistечко горіхове. Going through literature, especially culinary literature, marzipan is a cookie made of almonds, but tistечко горіхове, it means not cookie, but not does not mean almonds specifically. It is broader in its meaning. Some terms over here might be used, but just for the sake of fiction. For instance, costumer and Shatnech, cosmonaut and Zoraletu. But cosmologia with the same stem is Всесвітознавство and kosmichny Всесвітній. Well, I believe that here there is only partial correspondence. They do not overlap completely, therefore they should not be substituted.
And a few words now about the motivated terminology, which in our opinion could be brought back and probably also suggested to the professionals to use them in their research. For example, aphasia, mововтрата. Basically, this is when a person cannot articulate, cannot speak, aphasia. Автопортрет, власнообраз. Here we're talking about self-portrait. And here we're talking about doing the same using автопортрет, but Ukrainian words. Hypologia, also pretty interesting and motivated. Конознавство presently is pretty widespread. We have already mentioned природознавство and other areas, and I think конознавство is also pretty motivated. Veterinarian and тваринолікар, why not again? What else is interesting? Again, with the znavstvo, there are plenty of terminology which, in my opinion, has the right to exist, or at least be used in parallel, both using the borrowed term for the scientific text for the professionals and the parallel terminology with the znavstvo can be used for different textbook so that students can better understand the material, because I think that if we look at mycologia versus Gryboznawstwo has a simpler to understand form, and it's easier for the student to memorize it. Because I also remember when I came across a situation when the students were asking what did the lecturer mean when they were only using international or borrowed terminology. So it's not always the case that first or second year university students can understand all of the borrowed terminology. Also, there was some interesting terminology that also creates certain word building structures. As you can see here, for example, міозит and міологія, м'язозапалення or м'язознавство. And speaking of such terminology, we managed to discover quite a few of them. Well, given that we're short on time, I'm not going to mention all of them out loud, but in my opinion, when we have this kind of word building structures, this already signifies that it has the right to exist in a specific sectoral terminology system, because it does not exist in a vacuum on its own. There are also other words that stem from it. And you can see the same when it comes with the гастросcopia, шлункоогляд, gastrostomia, шлункоростин. And a pretty interesting term is krasnucha, which presently can be found in different medical dictionaries. But krasnucha is more about the color, the color of the rash. But we don't have the word krasny in Ukrainian for red. So the option offered in the dictionary was червінка. Well, of course, you can think about the word model, but the logics, why черв? Why this element, in my opinion, is pretty well motivated. Also, in dictionaries, there was a parallel use of certain forms mentioned. And namely, we would like to mention штукатур or штукатурка-тинк, plasterer and plaster. For quite some time for me, plaster was associated with the Soviet Union. You keep plastering something and there's plaster and plaster. But we checked it. And in fact, this word stems from Italian. And tinkar, and other words come from the German language. Through Bulgarian, if I'm not mistaken, and Ukrainian language also borrowed it. And in the dictionaries, we found parallel forms. So in Russo-Ukrainian language of technical terminology, it was suggested to substitute штукатурка with тинкування, etc. And in Pavlo Shtepa's dictionary, in parallel, it was mentioned that you can use both штукатур and tinkar. Basically, if we're talking about the borrowed, the foreign terms, then probably the researcher, it's up to the researcher to pick which word they would like to use in one case or another. And here is another similar example with math. Багатокутник and многокутник. Why does polygon in English? Because again, an example from life. My son's textbook, one of them mentioned багатокутник and the other one mentioned многокутник, and we were arguing about which word is the correct one. Because багатокутник is what is a normal Ukrainian and used in it. But if we look at the dictionary of terminology by Kalinovich, многокутник is also a norm. From what I understand is by the analogy of многоэлита. So многокутник could also be used. And here it shows you all of the options of the terminology and only uses the form многокутник. So here you can see different types of these polygons. So again, it's probably better to ask mathematicians what we should use more. But I think that there should be one option that should be used consistently in textbooks, etc. But maybe I'm wrong. And speaking of conclusions, of course, and this research needs to be further elaborated because there is plenty of material to work with. But the main thing that I would like to point out is that this terminology that was eliminated, it probably should be reviewed together with the experts, with the professionals, so that we don't only analyze the linguistic character nature of them, and if some model can be offered that would be considered productive as of today, the professionals at the same time understand the notion. They understand how this term can be represented. And of course, probably it is worth recommending Ukrainian terminology for them to dominate in teaching materials so that students and school kids can better understand learning materials. But if we're talking about the academic text, in our opinion, it's better to probably use international terminology so that it is easy to understand it for all the professionals, especially when it comes to professionals from different countries, more of a globalized form of the academic discourse. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to respond to your questions if there are any. Thank you so much, Stanislava, for an amazing presentation. So, guys, go ahead. Please chime in. Any questions, comments, remarks? Well, while our colleagues are thinking about what to ask, maybe I could go ahead. I was taking notes and I have a few questions. I would like to start with your methodology. How did you pick the words for your research? And can we find some dictionaries in the open access that can be replenished, that can be worked with? I think it could be a good future project to have kind of a digitalized dictionary so that people could also chip in and also add different words on and in an online format. Okay, thank you for this question. Of course, now there are multiple different platforms where you can find dictionaries. The Institute of Encyclopedic Research of the Academy of Science of Ukraine is a special facility dedicated to creating these dictionaries, or rather reproducing the dictionaries that were destroyed or that you have only a few copies of in the archives, and they are trying to reproduce these dictionaries that were destroyed in 1930s, and on their website you can find it. And this is where I found the dictionary of math terminology, and there are other dictionaries available there too. And this work will continue, and there will be not only dictionaries of certain terminology, but also of nomenclature. For example, biological and zoological terminology that will also be analyzed by this institute. And I also used, well, not the archive, but how do I put it? Those materials that Taras Shevchenko community that also are available in your library and in our library, at our university library, but clearly they need a more detailed analysis because you have to analyze the material in much detail. and also figure out where terminology is mentioned and where recommendations and variants are mentioned. Very interesting. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please, if you have any questions, go ahead. Please don't be shy. Yes? Go ahead. Oksana, go ahead. Good afternoon. Well, it's not a question, but rather a comment. First, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. I'm a historian. It was incredibly interesting to listen about these discoveries and the word shtukar. So I was surprised that people don't know it because I was thinking all the time, there was this phrase when I'm an artist and shtukar, a joker, but yeah, maybe for the students, because there are lots of words that come from English, maybe for them it's more of an old word. And regarding the purism in language, I do agree with the opinion that what has to do with the academia, yes, probably we should use more Latin terminology, English terminology, something that will simplify international communication within the academia. Because looking for the equivalence in Ukrainian, on the one hand, is good for the development of the philological thinking. But I guess, yes, for communication purposes, it's better to find something that brings us closer to each other rather than create something of our own, because there's always something interesting in the language, so that we don't go from one extreme to another. As you said, krasnucha was червинка, right? And to me, this word червинка sounds like червяк. So something of that kind. Sounds like a worm in Ukrainian to me. This was my comment. Thank you, Oksana. Well, it seems to me that the model of this червонуха is more of a Russian. Червинка, or червянка, кровянка, селянка. Well, maybe then there is a different semantic connection. Yeah, thank you for your comment. Thank you, Oksana. Are there any more questions or comments? If that is not the case, then I'll take the floor again. Stanislava, I wanted to ask you about the military and war terminology. You have provided these two synonyms, battalion, and kurin. And I wanted to ask whether you came across multiple such terms, whether you have analyzed in detail the terminology that has to do with military domain and war. Are you planning to further study it? And what is the situation now, given the war in Ukraine? Are the old terminology long forgotten coming back? Or is there no place for them nowadays? Thank you for this question. In fact, there was a dictionary of the Russo-Ukrainian dictionary of military terminology. Sadly, cannot remember the author now, but it was from the 20th. And having looked through the dictionary, I can say that this terminology, well, not even terminology, in my opinion, this is a military vocabulary. It's mostly systemic, so we perceive them as something widely used, widespread. The only thing they remembered, the word hatamash, which is of today's seen as certain terminology. Maybe some parallels can be made, but in my opinion, there will be some minimal analogy if we compare it against the present day terminology. Well, this is my opinion only. I think that currently we already have new, so to say, military terminology that oftentimes, by the way, is created thanks to borrowing words from other languages and also certain slang. The newly created terminology that probably later on will be codified because there are no motivated terminology, but there are certain slang. So I think it will be also interesting to look into that and study that. Which slang can later on turn into terminology, become terminology. Thank you. Any more comments, thoughts? And we have a few more minutes, so one more question from me. Oh, Ludmila raised her hand. Go ahead. Svetlana, please go ahead. No. I have a very quick question. Aside from the Ukrainian Language Institute that works with this terminology, is there maybe some kind of a commission that also developed the criterion for bringing back old or outdated terminology or obsolete terminology? There is a commission, and by the way, it existed within the Institute of Ukrainian Language, but it didn't gather prior to the war. And now I think it is on hold. Okay, Ludmila, go ahead. Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, Stanislava, for such a to-the-point presentation. I would like to also ask a question. You mentioned that you're working with students who major in translation, and I am also teaching translation students terminology in their first foreign language. And tomorrow we have almost a final seminar, and we will be looking at translation of terminology in fiction. And I have already prepared for it, and now I have to ask a question. Maybe you could also help respond to some of the students' questions. And how do you think in fiction, translation, should we only resort to international words, or maybe these words, золотар, далекоглядачка, these words that you have mentioned, maybe this kind of vocabulary can come in handy when working with fiction. And what is now used mostly in fiction when it comes to this kind of terminology? And maybe it can be both krasnucha, or maybe then sometimes you can also use synonyms because it's fiction. So what do we do in this kind of translation? What should translators do to not make mistakes so that in a specific context they can use the most suitable, the best suitable word? A piece of advice from you, please.
Thank you for this question. Actually, we discussed it multiple times with my students, future translators. We often bring up the topic of the translation being adequate or not, and whether they should stick to every word or whether they should try to convey the overall atmosphere of a literary piece. Well, I believe that a translator, first and foremost, has to be aware of what the author's worldview was. It has to be from the author's perspective, as there are certain concepts that are permanent, and therefore you need to opt for a term that is already codified. But if the situation is slightly different, if an author has their own style, and then I believe that translators should opt for something extraordinary, something that is not codified. For instance, Zverchnik that I mentioned earlier. I enjoyed that lexeme a lot. I felt that it was just some a specific feature of a translator, or no, it was an attempt to convey certain conflict, certain clash of cultures between Japan and Western world. Since a person from the Western world would always cause certain jokes and condescending attitude from Japanese. Therefore, this specific terminology reflected all that you are as if lower in your status. Therefore, they are your superiors. And the use of the term zverchnik is very up to the point, since керівник would not reflect the connotation of in this novel. Therefore, we have to take into consideration we are translating. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stanislava, for your brilliant presentation. And now I would like to